I love that you like the remarkable too. I'm so obsessed with that.
Yes. Take it everywhere.
I don't recommend the keyboard. It was useless.
I wasn't tempted, yeah. I need to write Veena in here.
Yeah, me.
So I got this.
I shouldn't have gotten it. I was like, oh, maybe, but stupid.
It's good. You look like my decision.
Yes, it was good.
All right. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for coming to our fourth and, for this semester, final installment of the Social Justice for Data Science lecture series. So this series is hosted by the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences and organized by myself and Professor Ngozi Okidegbe. And the goal of this series is to engage with the relationship between justice and data science, including investigating the ways that data science operates to advance, hinder, and transform justice-oriented movements in different areas of life. So our speaker today is Professor Veena Dubal. So Professor Dubal is a professor of law at the University of California Hastings College of Law, and she holds both a JD and a PhD in jurisprudence and social policy from the University of California, Berkeley. Her research focuses on law and technology and precarious workers, and she combines legal and empirical analysis to explore issues of labor and inequality. So today she'll be talking to us about myth and measurement of digitized wages in platform work. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dubal.
Thank you so much for this lovely invitation. My mic is on, yeah? For this wonderful invitation. And also thank you to all of the people in the audience today. This is a very early stage article, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts and feedback. I also want to just call out that I invited my oldest son for the first time to come hear me talk, so he's here, very embarrassed, but I'm very excited to have him. And all of my little nephews and nieces in their various forms are here as well, which is just like the best talk I could ever possibly give. So again, I am delighted to be here today to talk to you about digitalized wages and platform work. In the last few years, there have been two states largely understood as worker-friendly states with progressive electorates and democratic majority legislatures that have passed the first third category worker laws in the Western Hemisphere. So I know some of you are from law and some of you are from data science and some of you might even be from elsewhere. So I'm just gonna explain to you a little bit about what it means, what this third category of worker actually is, what it means. So in the US, and in fact in many other countries, we have essentially two categories of workers. We have employees and independent contractors. And when the first set of federal laws were passed in the 1930s during the Great Depression that gave workers all of these base level rights, like the minimum wage, like the right to collectively bargain, like the right to unemployment insurance if you are terminated by no fault of your own, like the right to workers' compensation if you're injured on the job. When all of these laws were passed, the laws were intended, if you look at the legislative history, to just cover workers. It didn't really distinguish between employees and independent contractors. But over time, namely in the 1940s, with a change in the politics of the US legislature and the inventiveness of clever lawyers, we got these independent contractor carve-outs, where all of a sudden there were some workers who were not protected by the basic rights that were accorded to all people during the New Deal. This number started out to be quite small. It was like when President Truman actually vetoed a law that carved independent contractors out of the Social Security Act. He said, you know, I can't sign this because it would carve insurance salesmen and taxi workers and other such workers out of the protection of these laws. His veto was overridden by Congress, but at the time it just wasn't a big deal because the workforce was largely built around manufacturing. It wasn't a service economy just yet. Today, as a result of many different, what economist David Wiles calls fissuring practices, there are a growing number of people who are at least treated like independent contractors. And now there's this third category of worker, which exists somewhere in between these two. In Canada, in the UK, and in Italy, these third category of worker has existed for some time and generally allocates some basic rights to workers, like minimum wage, to all workers, regardless of whether of their status, but not all of them. And in the US, as I said, we've never had this kind of law until the past couple of years with the passage of two different laws in the two most progressive states in the country. In California, this happened through the passage of Proposition 22 in 2020, which is the first law in the US in the past 100 years that basically recreated, re-legalized piecework. So piecework had been abolished by the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, re-legalized piecework, so workers are no longer paid according to time, but instead according to after they are allocated a job, like after you're allocated a ride by Uber, then you're paid, but not while you're waiting for a ride. And then all of the other benefits that you have, whether it's some form of accident insurance, whether it's some form of paid time off, all of this gets tied to not all the time that you work, but only the time that you work after you're allocated a job. And critically, this time when you're waiting for a job becomes a node of power because it's not based on the supply in the market or how close you are to a customer. It's based on when the system decides to allocate you a job. So in Washington state, a similar law was passed. Instead of essentially just legalizing the business model of paying workers by the piece, Washington state at least provides a base fare minimum for transportation network company workers and gives them mileage and minute payment, but it's still not paying workers for all the time. So they're not getting minimum wage, they're not getting overtime. All of a sudden wages are disconnected from time altogether, making them quite unpredictable. So these third category laws are specifically tailored to the on-demand business model that you're most familiar with via the company Uber. And they're being replicated not only all over the country, but now all over the world, with versions of them being considered, introduced, or passed now in Chile, Colombia, and Brazil. So even as Colombia and Brazil have new leftist prime ministers, presidents, both Petro and Lula, both their administrations have embraced some version of this, surprisingly, even though their administrations have aggressively campaigned to fight economic inequality. So the question for me is, well, how did this happen? As I was doing this PowerPoint, I discovered stock figures in PowerPoint. I was very excited by this. You will see stock figures throughout my PowerPoint. I thought this was really funny last night around midnight, perhaps less amusing to all of you. So the question, how did all this happen? How did these progressive states, how did these extremely leftist governments come to embrace a law that essentially creates unpredictable wages for in the US, a racial minority workforce, and in Colombia, Chile, and Brazil, workforces that are on the very margins of the labor market? There are many possible explanations, all of which likely played a role. Of course, the hard bargaining of these companies, their structural and political power, the use of racial liberalism as a weapon to obscure the nature of the law, which is something that I've written about at some length. But one central explanation that I try and get at in this paper is the role of myths generated by academic studies, measuring average wages and worker satisfaction in on-demand work. So the myths generated are largely as follows. Workers like on-demand work, they make a decent living if they work smart and hard, and they prefer scheduling flexibility over the minimum wage. This is what any number of studies by economists, by historians have sort of attempted to convey over the past 10 years, and I call them myths for a reason, which I'll get to. So understood through the lens of the history of ideas, these myths represent a dramatic departure from the last 30 years of economic thought in relationship to work, well-being, and the minimum wage. So as some of you might recognize, the title of my talk and of this article in particular alludes to this seminal book by David Card and Alan Kruger called Myth and Measurement, The New Economics of the Minimum Wage. So this book, which first came out in 1995, shifted how economists and policymakers talked about and understood the minimum wage as a social policy. So throughout much of the early 20th century, minimum wage laws, as you likely know, were viewed as an intrusive form of government overreach into economic decisions of businesses. And in fact, the minimum wage was illegal in the US. It was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court between 1923 and 1937. And it wasn't until the following year, 1938, the year after this decision in West Coast Hotel v. Parrish, that the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. And the Fair Labor Standards Act was the result of decades of labor agitation in the face of human suffering. And it implemented the first federal minimum wage and overtime laws and explicitly outlawed, as I said, piecework. You could not pay workers per piece of thing that they produced or per service. You had to pay them by the hour. So proponents said the bill would, quote, end unnecessarily long hours which wear out part of the working population while they keep the rest of us from having to do work, end quote. They noted that a minimum wage would support the entire wage infrastructure by creating a floor that workers could leverage to achieve higher wages through collective bargaining. And although there were notable problems with the Fair Labor Standards Act, which I've written about elsewhere, including the exclusion of domestic workers and agricultural workers, exclusions that were the direct result of post-slavery plantation economies in the South, at least conceptually, this piece of legislation was a radical piece of legislation that positively impacted the lives and livelihoods of many white families, spreading work and drastically decreasing the then 25% unemployment rate. So after the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the field of economics maintained for decades that minimum wage laws were a macroeconomic evil, and that any rise in the minimum wage would result in disemployment, in unemployment. So pulled in as late as the 1970s, the vast majority of economists, still steeped not in empiricism, this is before the empirical turn, but really in theory, believed that raising the minimum wage again would increase unemployment. So dissatisfied with these existing methodological approaches to minimum wage studies, now famous economist David Card, who won the Nobel Prize just a couple of years ago for this book, or for this work, and Alan Kruger, who sadly died in 2019, they in the late 1980s began looking for natural experiments to test the minimum wage and ask, in the context of natural experiments, do we really see unemployment? And this work, in many ways, took for granted that workers wanted the minimum wage and generally wanted their wages to be higher. In the most famous of these studies, which led to the writing and publication of this seminal book, which was first published in 1995, Card and Kruger compared employment in fast food restaurants in New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania before and after New Jersey raised its state minimum wage from $4.25 to $5.05 an hour. And their findings were wholly inconsistent with the hypothesis that minimum wage laws necessarily raise unemployment. And to the contrary, they found employment growth in both New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. And they had the natural a dramatic cultural shift in how policymakers and empirical researchers understood the efficacy of wage floors, of time-based wage floors. Indeed, in the UK and Germany, national minimum wages were instituted as a result, in part, of these findings. Minimum wage laws in the US became highly popular in public opinion polls, and though the federal minimum wage has not been raised since 2009 and remains at $7.25 an hour, many state legislatures and an unprecedented number of city councils established and raised local minimum or living wages, armed with these findings. So in the 1990s and 2000s, following the publication of this book, much pro-worker advocacy and policy work, including perhaps most famously the Fight for 15 campaign, singularly focused on leveraging this research to raise the minimum wage across different low-wage sectors and to stabilize the number of hours that people worked. Again, with the idea, as during the Great Depression, that people should not be working for 60 hours a week to earn a living. But while workers' advocates were focusing their efforts on using legislative democratic mechanisms to create predictable schedules and higher incomes for low-wage workers, some firms began to shift and obscure, using technology, how they calculated and allocated wages so as to escape entirely the legal and cultural consensus around the minimum wage. Beginning in roughly 2013, in the shadows of the Great Recession, new logistics companies, most infamously Uber, Instacart, DoorDash, and Lyft, began hiring workers to do transportation and food delivery work. And the advent of these companies and their payment allocation systems represented a brand new and troubling cultural shift, one that was intertwined with and justified by the politics of innovation and technology. And while these companies may be familiar to you, the way that they determine how workers are paid is likely not. Instead of paying them workers by the hour as per a local minimum wage law, they insist that workers are not employees, but independent business people who do not benefit from any of the traditional employment rights, again. And instead of getting paid predictable wages, though low, for a fixed number of hours that are often variable and uncertain from week to week, on-demand workers began getting paid an unpredictable amount per hour and being told that they could work for as long as they wanted. Again, Alan Krueger of Card and Krueger played a critical role. So the book catapulted Alan Krueger's career. He was later tapped as the chief economist under President Bill Clinton and later Assistant Secretary of the Treasury from 2009 to 2010 under Barack Obama, where he helped to lead the US out of the Great Recession. But in 2016, Krueger's research served to undermine rather than buttress the centrality of the minimum wage in the lives of working people, and particularly the working poor. Let me very quickly pause and insert myself into this research. So I, from roughly 2012 to 2021, conducted an on-the-ground ethnography of workers who labored in these new, in this new form of work. And most of my thousands of hours of participant observation and everyday conversations with on-demand workers took place in airport holding lots and regulatory meetings in workers' homes and cafes, in driver organizing meetings, at protests, et cetera. I did a number of life histories, conducted hundreds of in-depth individual interviews, did focus groups, did a survey. And during this decade, I observed a continual drop in worker wages overall and constant changes in the ways in which their pay was determined. It seemed like there was constant as a result of sort of worker anger and agitation around their erratic and low wages, interest in implementing minimum wage laws and protections for these on-demand workers grew. And several important class action lawsuits alleging that the companies were actually violating the minimum wage were filed in federal court in California in 2016 amidst my research. They were undermined by private arbitration decisions after the US Supreme Court's Epic Systems decision 2 years into the litigation. Lawmakers who had initially been sort of dazzled by the technology and the consumer convenience also started to take notice of the low and erratic wages and began conversations about enforcing the minimum wage in these sectors. Around the same time, a working article was posted online. This article, written by Jonathan Hall, Uber's chief economist, and Alan Krueger, the Princeton labor economists who had helped to shape policy discussions, again, all over the world in favor of minimum wage, made surprising findings. And it was published in the prestigious National Bureau of Economics Research as a working paper. This article claimed to provide the first comprehensive analysis of the labor market for Uber's partners, not workers, partners, that the first time that you saw this term used in academic literature. They used both survey and administrative data and found that drivers who partner with Uber, not work for Uber, but partner with Uber, quote, appear to be attracted to the platform largely because of the flexibility it offers, the level of compensation, and the fact that earnings per hour do not vary very much with the number of hours worked. So I was frankly, when this paper came out, perplexed by the study, which contrasted so dramatically with what I was seeing and hearing among drivers on a daily basis. And given Krueger's prior research and his bona fides with Democratic administrations, the study had a significant impact on legal and policy discussions both in the US and globally. So simplified versions of the paper were popularized through a variety of mainstream publications, including by the likes of Farhad Manjoo, and used to counter any criticism of Uber's business mode in academic conversations. In fact, someone threw this in my face the other day when I was giving a talk. The findings made their way into regulatory rooms, including in congressional testimony by Joe Kennedy, who stated that to stave off the notion that these workers needed access to the minimum wage, quote, a survey of Uber drivers showed that the vast majority are happy working for the company. They greatly value the flexibility in terms of when and how much to work. They also seem happy with the pay, end quote. However, as I and ILO economist Janine Berg and geographer Hannah Johnson detailed in later articles, the paper's claims about overall Uber driver satisfaction and the value of driver flexibility were based on surveys fraught with serious methodological problems, including a very low response rate, loaded and deliberately misleading questions, and extraordinary sample bias. Its findings with regard to wages were particularly fraught. Economist Hubert Horan later detailed, this paper seriously overstated Uber's driver earnings by using gross revenue instead of true take-home pay. It briefly mentioned that Uber drivers must bear the full vehicle expenses and financial risks, while the taxi drivers they compared to do not and fail to analyze the impact of these additional expenses and risks on true driver earnings. So despite these sort of deep and troubling problems, the myths about on-demand work promulgated by Hall and Krueger's article helped to forestall the enforcement of existing workers' rights, including minimum wage rights for on-demand workers. Additionally, Krueger's specific involvement buttressed the prestige of Uber's academic partnerships and programs and prompted an array of other respected academics to consult for the company and similar companies using data and parameters provided by these firms to come to conclusions that often undermine the application of the minimum wage to on-demand work, obscuring not just the applicability, but also the purpose of the minimum wage. Indeed, a whole host of other papers emerged in the following years with empirical outcomes that mirrored Uber's business objectives but undermined minimum wage protections, authored not just by Alan Krueger, but also by Judd Kramer, Peter Cohen, Robert Hahn, Stephen Levitt, Keith Chen, Judith Chevalier, Peter Rossi, and many, many others. By 2020, amid the COVID-19 pandemic and presidential debates, this dispute about Uber driver wages made it to the New York Times. The newspaper's labor reporter, Noam Scheiber, wrote that the most contested, by the way, this is me when I read the papers, wrote that the most contested question about the gig economy is not the employment status of its workers, but exactly how much on average a worker makes. So these kinds of economics debates don't very frequently make their way into the mainstream press, but this one did. The contested number, the amount or average amount that on-demand workers make in the ride-hail and food delivery sectors was and is hugely consequential for both workers and for the companies that hire them. High wages suggested that perhaps these companies did not need to be regulated with regard to their wages because they were self-regulating. And low wages, of course, suggested the opposite. The debate that this article highlights was happening, again, as those laws that I told you about at the very beginning of the talk, as California and Washington states were actually attempting to do the opposite. They were attempting to enforce employment protections, to enforce the minimum wage and overtime for the workforces in their states. So again, as the states were sort of finally acting to give these low-wage populations, these people of color populations, the minimum wage protections, we saw this debate erupt. So in the lead up to these legislative battles, Uber strategically shared select data with historian Louis Hyman, who wrote an important book called Temp on the last many decades of precarious work, and several Cornell economists known for their association with Democratic administrations. Louis Hyman's research, paid for by Uber and later touted by Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi, found that a typical Uber driver in Seattle made $23 an hour. Sounds pretty good. And he found that 92% of workers made above the minimum wage. The message being, Washington state doesn't need to pass a law to ensure that these drivers get the minimum wage. Hyman declared that he too was surprised by the findings, but also vigorously defended his research and contested the independent critiques of his colleagues, which made their way to the New York Times. University of Chicago economist Luigi Zingales was quoted by the Times as saying, "We all make assumptions. If at the end of the day you want to please who gave you the data, you might choose a certain set of assumptions." An alternative analysis using similar data was conducted by labor economists James Parrott and Michael Reich and commissioned by the city of Seattle and arrived at a very different number. Just about $9.74 an hour, and they found that the vast majority of drivers made below the minimum wage. And the difference between the two figures turned largely not on the quality of the data that was being used, but as Zingales intimated in his quote, on how the research groups calculated overhead costs for workers. So in the Hyman Uber analysis, Uber insisted that the investigation not include tips and costs associated with the vehicle, while in the other research, in the Parrott-Rice research, workers, because workers often purchase cars to work for the companies and maintain their vehicles to labor based on requirements set forth by Uber, the researchers insisted that they include those costs as well as subtracting tips. Notably, absent in the coverage of this debate, however you cut it, was that both studies, even the one that found the $23 an hour, both studies found that some workers made below the minimum wage. And that workers who performed substantially similar work received dramatically different wages, and that the wages that an individual worker received was generally impossible to precisely ascertain or predict. So even over the span of just a few days, individual workers made dramatically different amounts for the same kind of work. In the Parrott and Reich study, for example, they found an average variation over $20 between the 5th and 95th percentile for driver earnings, so quite dramatic. And in my own research on on-demand drivers, I found that retrospectively, many workers were entirely unsure about how much money they made per hour, and in some cases actually lost. So this finding, this uncertainty of how much workers made and how much they thought they were making, one that came out of this long-term ethnographic research, pushed me to resituate the debate. So in a paper that came out just last week in the Columbia Law Review, I argued that the issues with wages in the on-demand economy is not just their indeterminacy, it's not just the uncertainty or unpredictability, but it's actually the black box nature of their calculation. So workers get digitalized variable pay based on what the firms know about them, about their income targets, their habits, their location, and their work practices. And I've called this practice algorithmic wage discrimination. This is, again, this new wage allocation practice that deviates so far from a predictable, even in some cases, bargained for wage floor. And I show that on-demand labor platform companies adopted this practice of calculating wages in this highly personalized and variable way to solve a particular problem that often accompanies the misclassification of workers as independent contractors. So when you treat a driver as an employee, the primary indicia of employment status is control. How much control do you exert over how the worker does their work? And so these firms, they don't want to tell a worker to go here or there because then it looks like they're an employer. So instead, they use data extracted from workers' labor and fed into automated tools to incentivize their temporal and spatial movement. In other words, they use algorithmic wage discrimination to direct worker behavior without explicitly directing them and to solve the problem of meeting demand. So companies like Uber refer to some of the mechanisms by which they determine driver pay as dynamic pricing, explicitly drawing a connection between consumer price discrimination and their black box wage allocation practices. This latter practice, this consumer price discrimination, typically you're probably most familiar with it in the context of coupons or student discounts, bulk purchases, the idea that you pay differently per item based on these, like your status as a student, or the fact that you bought a newspaper that got you a coupon, or what have you. These are examples of clear price discrimination that long predate algorithmic price discrimination. More recently, you're familiar probably with algorithmic price discrimination in the context of buying airline tickets and other, Taylor Swift tickets or whatever. Now companies use data algorithms to keep track of your behavior, your shopping habits, where you might live, and efficiently market things to you accordingly. Recent research suggests that consumer price discrimination actually in hospital services and housing and the ride-hail sectors all exacerbate racial inequalities, even absent intentional discriminatory profiling. And now we know that Uber is actually doing this to how they allocate wages to people. They're using the same sort of system to allocate wages. Uber and similar companies, I think, have broken new ground by using these methods to determine worker pay. Indeed, rather than setting wages to the minimum wage, like companies like McDonald's or Walmart do, they pay workers using behavioral science. So experimenting with video game techniques, with graphics, with cash rewards to prod drivers into working longer and harder, and sometimes at hours and locations that are less lucrative to them. So US-based Uber drivers who were previously paid a base pay based on mileage and time in the last few years have been paid according to upfront pricing. So this is totally black box base fee that Uber determines. There have been efforts to figure out what goes into this determination. They have not budged in sharing this information. They also allocate wage manipulators to different workers, basically giving them offers and bonuses and surges and quests to raise their base fare, which is often too low by itself. Companies like Rappi, Glovo, Foodora, Lyft, all of these companies all over the world now have replicated this combination of sort of behavioral science and data science to shape worker behavior and pay them. The relevant point here, though, is that these wages are not the same per driver. They're not the same across time for individual drivers. For firms, the uncertainty that accompanies digitalized variable pay is a way to obscure the harms of how they direct workers and how they pay them. But as I discuss in great length in this article, the uncertainty is itself a harm. So even when you have high prices occasionally, not knowing how much workers make every day creates a situation in which they experience their labor through the lens of gambling and trickery. And if you're interested, I direct you to the details in this paper. But to date, this gambling and trickery and the low and unpredictable wages endemic to on-demand work have largely been obscured by the mythologies of flexibility and job satisfaction that I've alluded to earlier. These mythologies have largely been generated not only through company propaganda, but also through this quantitative research and short survey-based research, beginning, of course, with Hall and Alan Kruger's work in 2016. And the effect has been regulatory outcomes that substantiate calls for a third category of worker and obfuscate the harms of digitalized variable payment system as workers themselves have articulated them. So I asked at the beginning, like, how did we get here? This is one huge way. The role of academics in the story is one huge way that we arrived here. And I argue that we are now in a new cultural moment, almost without noticing. We're in this new cultural moment with regard to the history of economic ideas as they relate to minimum wage laws and the wage floor. While long-term qualitative research, mine and others, have drawn attention to how workers who labor under these models are working for 16 hours a day, sleeping in their car, unable to make ends meet, the policy debate has almost entirely focused on what Noam Scheiber pointed out in his New York Times article, how do we calculate the average wage? And in focusing on these sort of narrow and troubled questions of how much workers make and whether or not workers value their flexibility in relationship to their wages, this quantitative research has perhaps purposefully concealed the digitalized and personalized nature of these new wage setting schemes and the downstream harms that they may cause. So not only are wages low and often an estimate of the lowest amount that workers are willing to accept. In fact, there are data scientists and economists on staff whose job it is to figure out how low a wage a worker is willing to accept. But they also necessarily involve the collection of wage data and data sets that are themselves quite valuable. So this data may follow workers outside of the firm. It may lead to suppressed wages and economic mobility over the course of their lives, while also increasing exposure to certain types of products, like predatory loans and bad insurance. So this debate has also directed attention away from the ways in which drivers themselves have been contesting their experience with algorithmic wage discrimination. So in my ethnographic research, although workers didn't initially have this term that I have sort of provided, algorithmic wage discrimination, to talk about what they were experiencing, they have been organizing against variable pay for some time. So one group of drivers that I study in California, they sued Uber and Lyft in state court, alleging that the wage setting practices that I call algorithmic wage discrimination violate fair business practices with regard to fraud, because they are often manipulated into thinking they're going to earn more than they actually do. In the UK, Worker Info Exchange has used GDPR to try and understand how their wages are algorithmically calculated and what data goes into these calculations. Although they have won at the appellate level, Uber and Ola have refused to offer any insight into the explainability of wage determination. And other groups of workers have mobilized to collect their own data and data sets, using it to better understand what companies offer them better pay, where they get better pay, when they get better pay. But these data collectives fundamentally don't intervene in the economic relationship between the higher end entities and the workers, so they're not really able to even give workers the capability of figuring out how they could get a minimum wage, because there are constant wage experiments going on at these companies that change the wage allocation systems. So I make a regulatory call in this paper to address algorithmic wage discrimination through the implementation of wage floors and clear guidelines on how, if at all, to use price discrimination in the labor context. But I also seek to make a related argument about the importance of long-term qualitative research in on-demand work. So we've come a long, long way from debates about the efficacy of the minimum wage as a public policy. And the trajectory that this discussion has taken and the myths generated along the way are hurting racialized workforces and their family, while simultaneously obscuring wage allocation practices and experiments that are now extending far beyond how we conceptualize on-demand work to other service sectors. Some of these experiments can be captured through quantitative research, But I call upon both policymakers and researchers to look more clearly, not just, as has been the case, at the precise amount of wages that drivers or workers in these sectors make, but at the real present and long-term impacts of the unpredictability, of how this impacts accidents, of how this impacts traffic, of how it impacts how wages are related to worker health and safety, how it impacts long-term economic mobility, and creates, re-entrenches, and exacerbates racialized and gendered disparities in the labor market. So I look forward to your questions, and I thank you for listening. Maybe I'll just go back to the... I really deeply felt all of the stock photos that I used.
So thank you so much. That was fabulous.
Oh,
I
thank
have
you.
a million questions. I'll start us off with a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. You started talking about this a little bit at the end, but I would love to hear a bit more if you have stories of some of the more successful like concerted actions against workplace surveillance, or it's very interrelated, but this like variable wage.
Yeah. So one thing that I didn't say that makes me, when you say this, it makes me think that this should be an important part, maybe an important part of the paper, is that one thing that these practices have incentivized is heightened workplace surveillance and normalized workplace surveillance. So prior to the pandemic, I think the number was that 1/3 of major US employers use some form of digital surveillance. That number has now shifted dramatically. I think it's like 75% of major employers, or at least some of their workforce, use some form of digital surveillance. And what has become extraordinarily normalized in determining wages algorithmically is all the surveillance that goes into the data collection that enables this. So how fast a driver is going is recorded, when they brake is recorded, how quickly they brake is recorded, their location is recorded, where they start their work is recorded, when they stop their work is recorded, and all of this data is used to make inferences about who they are, about what kinds of wages they're willing to accept, when they're willing to work, how they're willing to work. Also, lots and lots of data that goes beyond wage allocation to other sort of valuable data sets that they then sell to cities, to other firms, et cetera, or might sell, I don't know that for sure. The way in which this has been normalized, I just want to say, is very scary to me. So over the course of these 10 years, I started doing this research with taxi workers, and I remember when they started using GPS in taxis. And I remember being in a taxi office, in a manager's office, and the manager was showing the drivers how they now use GPS and how the GPS enabled them to see how fast drivers were going. And this, like the centralized nature of it. And one of the drivers said, like, what's next, video cameras so you can watch me pick my nose? And it really, I think about that moment all the time, because now video cameras are so ubiquitous. In fact, like, you would never think of this as a privacy issue that we really want to, that maybe that we want to reject for any number of reasons, right? Like, we moved from that space to this space in the workplace. And so the kinds of surveillance that these workers experience, some ostensibly for their safety, some ostensibly for your safety, some most explicitly for wage allocation reasons and for meeting demand, are quite intrusive and travel well beyond, again, the parameters of the firm. And workers have resisted not necessarily the things like the cameras, they've resisted things like the face surveillance. So there is really interesting data that you probably are aware of to suggest that face surveillance, that the technology disproportionately gets black faces wrong, right? And so this has led to a lot of deactivations for Black workers in the US and in the UK. So it means that they just lose their job because every week you have to take a picture of yourself to prove to Uber that is in fact you and not someone else driving under your name. And because this face surveillance technology doesn't work, people are deactivated. So there has been several lawsuits under GDPR in Europe alleging face surveillance. These have been successful. There's some really good information on that if you want to go to the Worker Information Exchange website. And it's another research project that I'm doing actually. And then there has been this lawsuit also by Worker Info Exchange. These are workers themselves who are suing to get both the data that goes into that is extracted from their labor and how that data, to get explanations of how that data is being used to determine their wages. And that lawsuit, I think they're accruing $100,000 a day penalty every time Uber doesn't comply, and it's been several months. So I think that they're going to be a very wealthy nonprofit in a short period of time. And then I think the other stuff that's really interesting is, again, the antitrust lawsuits alleging that price discrimination violates antitrust laws. It was just completely fascinating. But I want to say some of this is quite complicated, right? It took me a really long time to kind of figure out what was going on, and even a longer time to articulate it as someone who's not trained in computer science. And so what's notable to me is that almost all driver agitation, all the strikes and all the organizing actually have erupted after Uber changes something dramatically in how they allocate wages. So the first strike ever at LAX in 2015, I want to say, it wasn't the first strike ever. The first strike ever globally was Uber headquarters in 2013, also related to wage drops. But this one happened at LAX as a result of the way that it's a little bit complicated, but basically the way that drivers' wages, everyone is using a trick where they turned on the app at a particular time in relationship to where they were to the airport, and it gave them higher wages than if they turned it on in a different place. And everyone was doing this, and then it stopped working. And people who were doing it, some of them got terminated. And so they protested, and the idea then was that if I'm an independent business person, I can develop whatever technique I want to raise my wages, and this is one of those techniques. And so it's notable that as I look back at my research, that almost all of the incidents of major driver protests and strikes actually relate to algorithmic shifts in wage allocation processes, but I didn't yet have the language to describe that was what was happening.
Interesting. I wonder if the changes are happening at a more and more rapid pace, if that will stop being the correlation because people just don't have time to get their feet under them.
Yeah, I think what happens is, and this is a form of really interesting collective action, what happens is that you figure something out, some technique out, and then you share the technique with your friends, you share it on Facebook, on WhatsApp groups, and over time it becomes something that a bunch of people do, and then the company figures out that all these people are doing it, and then they change it. And so it's, on the one hand, there are experiments that these companies are doing behavioral science experiments constantly, right? All the time on these workers. They don't know that they're being experimented on, but it's happening all the time. And the drivers are kind of conducting their own experiments too, in a way to, collectively, in a way to figure out how to raise their wages. I mean, with much less information, with total, information asymmetry, but they're logically and rationally doing the same thing. And once it becomes powerful, you got to shift, and you have the company sort of take the tool away. And I have it is a common thing that you hear drivers say that this is what makes them employers: the power to introduce tools and to take the tools away, to introduce tools and take the tools away.
So this is touching on something I was really interested in, and so I wonder if this is maybe you can say more about the Worker Information Exchange if that's where it's happening. Yeah. But what do you see as a way forward for either workers collecting their own sort of data sets and sort of, are there opportunities for workers or worker allies to leverage data science against the companies for a better wage?
Yeah, so I think that the answer here is wage floors. Like I think that the introduction of data science for wage allocation is very, very dangerous because it necessarily creates information asymmetries that are never going to do right by workers in an environment that's not a cooperative environment or one in which there is a work council that establishes rules for how those wages are allocated, et cetera. So, in my ideal world, and it's a world that's being considered by certain members of Congress, there would be a prohibition on determining wages algorithmically altogether. In terms of what I think is probably a realistic path forward in the near future, the platform work directive, even though California was the first state to sort of try and regulate the wages of these companies, interestingly, we've gone backwards and literally gone backwards. And in the process, the European Union has really put together through tripartite discussions a platform work directive that in some ways is quite good, in some ways has problems, but it does some very good things, and it ventures into what I've called just data abolition, like not allowing some forms of data to be collected and not allowing data to be used for some things. They haven't done it for wage allocation, but they have done it for face surveillance. They've also done it for emotional recognition. They say for both of these purposes, there should be absolute prohibition in the workplace on the use of these technologies, and I'd like to see this extended to wage allocation as well. Instead, they try and get to wage allocation through minimum wage and overtime laws. And so we have seen in some nations, so Spain is the one place in the world that has, through the Riders Act, what's called the Riders Law, R-I-D, not writer, but Riders Law. They have gotten a lot of these companies to abide by minimum wage and overtime laws. And you have companies like Uber who have done this via staffing agencies. So they basically have just gone the temp worker route. So it's not like it's great work. It's like working for McDonald's or Walmart in the sense that you're still making really, really low wages, but you are doing it with a flexible schedule. So it hasn't impacted scheduling as they constantly say it will. And you at least have the example of them providing wages that are clear and not so variable and not so unpredictable. There is at least one researcher that I know of that's looking at the Spanish context to see kind of how that plays out, which I'll be very, very sort of interested to see. But if I were to hypothesize, my guess would be, again, we're back in a Walmart world where Walmart's still like the worst employer ever, but we have wage predictability. And I think that's really important to remember for this, is because I think because it seems so new or did seem so new and so ubiquitous and so great that everyone could just like press a button and get work or press a button and get a service, there's not a lot of thought to how it's such a regression. I mean, that's the point of this paper, is that you started fighting you finally got to a place where the minimum wage was sort of ubiquitously accepted, and now not. Now we're into like a whole nother debate and a whole nother world. And Lorena Gonzalez is the president of the director of the California Labor Fed said to me the other day, like, I'd never thought I'd be in a place where I'd be like, let's just get back to Walmart. Let's just like get back to the Walmart world. Like this is that bad.
What do you think that policymakers don't understand about the day-to-day lives of Uber drivers?
That's such a good question. I mean, the point of the paper is really to say, like, stop paying attention just to the econometric sort of analysis and really look at the 10 books that evaluate the everyday lives of Uber drivers, of food delivery workers, of people who are dog walking via an app, of people who are like nursing now via an app, like educators who are working via apps, and ask them, don't just ask like in your one-off interview, like what is this actually like, but look at the in-depth research. And like what I want to say most, or what I think is most most important, and what I say to policy makers all the time is that it's not just that workers are making wages that are too low, it's that they're making wages that are so unpredictable, which also leads to unpredictability of hours. So it's not like amazing that you can work whenever you can work, because that also means you can literally work for 16 hours a day. And so, it's really, really transforming work experiences. I have a new project on worker health and safety that investigates exactly what I talked about at the end, which looks at, well, how do these unpredictable wages, how do they impact psychological safety, physical safety? And if we think about, I have a piece in Jacobin that came out about a month ago, if we think about platforms as machines in the way that, the Ford made a conveyor belt and introduced this conveyor belt into the factory. If we think about platforms as machines, well, Ford over the course of the 20th century had to make that conveyor belt safe. They had to have regulations that made the conveyor belt safe. They had to abide by OSHA laws and regulations to make the conveyor belt safe. Well, we need to do the same thing with regard to these platforms. And it's not just the physical danger of the low wages, which, there is a plethora of physical danger. This causes accidents, it causes people to drive really fast, it causes people to drive without sleep, et cetera. But it's also the psychological danger of having machines that create low and variable wages for people such that they can't know for sure that they're going to be able to make ends meet in any given month.
Yeah, I was thinking about this when you said that there are these studies that say people are happy in their jobs, because that's such a nonsensical question, like relative to what?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I remember when I was giving, at my former university, we had this practice where before you got tenure, you had to give a grand talk. And I was on maternity leave, and so I was very angry that I had to give this grand talk. And then someone stood up, an economist stood up and told me about his last conversation with the driver and how happy he was. And I just sort of was like,
you're wrong.
Yeah, exactly, I was wrong, right? But what I said was, well, you have the power to terminate this driver. The fact that you can provide a star rating that leads to the driver's ultimate inability to labor and make money for his family means that the answer that you're going to get in this one-off interview that you did with the driver is probably like not reflective of that person's reality, which is why so much of the survey data, I think, is actually quite flawed, and why I think that long-term research is really important.
Yeah. Maybe we can open it up to the audience. I'm sure there are a lot of questions if you've been formulating them in your minds. Yeah, there's a mic that'll come around, so we'll make it around the room.
Hi there. So thank you so much for this talk. I'll start off by saying that I'm a major in economics, so this question is a bit dangerous, but I'll try.
Okay.
So provided two competing definitions of what the minimum wage should be in Seattle. So I guess my question is, why should the minimum wage or the wages of workers account for the various costs that you mentioned? And I guess this is important because it's double the difference in terms of wages.
Yeah.
But also as a follow-up, because you mentioned how the cost of uncertainty is huge for platform workers. How does this compare to other forms of uncertainties that workers in all other industries face? For instance, workers in hospitality or tourism. Well, I guess when the pandemic came about, it took a huge hit on their earnings as well. For instance, the risk of losing their lives for firefighters.
Yeah.
I acknowledge that the cost of uncertainty is huge because your work showed that the bias in algorithms affect them heavily. But in terms of looking at them as jobs, how do they differ from other jobs? Thank you.
Yeah, these are great questions, and there's actually really good labor history that answers them. So on the one hand, you ask sort of why should minimum wage, if we're calculating the minimum wage, why should it consider vehicle costs? Why should it consider tips? Because the existing laws of those states mandate that employees who use their vehicles for firm purposes and who get tips that those calculations, that they should be reimbursed for vehicle costs, there's an IRS rate, and that they should, that tips should not be used to undermine their base wage. So these are policy discussions that have happened as a result of democratically engaged legislative discussions. These are laws that have been passed that these companies are choosing not to follow, but that your mom and pop bodega that does grocery delivery has to follow. So that's sort of one basic reason. It also just goes to the efficacy and the need for a minimum wage. So when you subtract all of your gas expenses and your insurance expenses and your vehicle expenses, and you're not making more than $5.75 an hour, which is what workers right now in California are making under Prop 22, then this is work that, as per FDR's famous quote, shouldn't exist. Because this is not the kind of work that we want in sort of a functioning industrial economy. With regard to certainty, so it's interesting. Like this is true in employment. So firefighters are paid a premium because of the dangers that they take on. Garbage truck workers are paid a premium because of the health dangers that they are exposed to in the course of their work. This is not minimum wage work, and this is an argument that I have made for a long time. So the fact that we're even talking about this in terms of the minimum wage is a concession. Like, this is work that is that deserves a premium because both of the nature of the importance of it, we're carrying people's bodies around, getting people to work, getting people to their families, getting people to doctor's appointments, et cetera. But it's also actually quite physically taxing and dangerous work. OSHA, prior to even the advent of Uber and Lyft, found that taxi work is one of the most dangerous professions, much more dangerous than police work, actually, and that has only become exacerbated with on-demand work for various reasons. So we want, if we live in I think, like a civilized society where we want to create good, safe work, particularly for vulnerable populations, we want to try and address uncertainty. And the minimum wage is one way in which we address sort of basic uncertainty. So I think across the political spectrum, there is a sense that you work hard and you work long and you should be able to provide for your family. This isn't just like this isn't a socialist idea. This isn't a democratic idea. This is something that, you know, that right-wing thinkers over the course of the last 30 years have pushed forth, that in America, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps with hard work and ingenuity. Here you have calculated machines that are making it impossible for people who work very hard to discharge themselves of risk. And that is something that is, I think, antithetical, no matter sort of how you think about the relationship between government and employment. This is something that is quite starkly different.
Hello, my name is Ox Maui. I want to thank you for coming out and speaking with us today. My question was about a specific point you brought up earlier in your talk. It was a certain state, it could have been Pennsylvania or Washington, but you mentioned that they raised the minimum wage. And in regards to restaurants, you said restaurants with people working for pay close to minimum wage and people working for pay farther away from minimum wage both saw an increase in labor. I was wondering why this occurred. Why was there an increase in labor felt by both minimum wage laborers and higher wage earners as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is the seminal Card and Kruger study in the book that I mentioned that was published in 1995, and it was in New Jersey that you had a minimum wage. So now economists who are looking at minimum wage, they are looking for natural experiments. They're literally just, instead of like rooting themselves in theory and well, what should happen in the context of supply and demand, and well, what actually does happen. So in that context, when they raised the minimum wage, you had an easy comparison. You had these restaurants that weren't affected by the raise in the minimum wage, because they already provided high wages. And then you had these restaurants where they had to raise the wage because they were paying the minimum wage. And in both contexts, the labor market itself grew. So there was no disemployment. Why it grew probably is unrelated to the rise in the minimum wage, probably had more to do with demand in that particular political economy. But the point of the study was that what you would have thought would have happened based on existing econ theory was that wages would have dropped, or sorry, that employers would have said, oh, now we have to pay people more, so we're going to employ less people. But in both contexts, they just shifted shifted their profits. Like maybe they took home less, but they gave their workers more, and they still had to hire more for whatever reason because demand increased. But the result was not less employment. So the importance of that study and ones that they replicated in all these different industries was that you don't automatically have unemployment when you raise wages. That's because employers are making decisions that are much more complicated than simply, well, if we're gonna have to raise wages, we're gonna keep labor costs level, so we're gonna just slough off some of the workers. Instead, they're like, okay, well, how can we work more efficiently? How can we pay ourselves less? How can we take out other costs because they ostensibly need workers in the space, and the workers are themselves likely working efficiently. Yeah, but it's a really interesting book that I recommend you look at. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, hi, I'm Roscoe Giles from Engineering and CDS. Part of the problem with Uber and platforms that you mentioned seems to me that it really is grounded in the information asymmetry from what the companies can do versus what the workers are able to do.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any thoughts about how to attack that directly. In other words, that asymmetry, so it isn't always a situation where the digital tools work in the favor of large organizations and employees?
Yeah, it's a great question. One way is through collective bargaining. And again, we don't have really good examples in the US still, but in the European context, there are some very good examples of of unions that have put forth some parameters around like just demanding, if you're gonna use these algorithms in the workplace, we need to know what information you're gathering, and we need to know precisely how you're using them, and like for example, what the quota system actually is, so that workers know if they're demoted or if they're dinged, they know it's because this quota system is in place, and the digital surveillance has judged that I am not meeting the quota. And so I really think, like as is often the case in the work context, the answer for information asymmetries or asymmetries of power is collective bargaining, workers banding together to create a space in which they are as powerful as the employer in making their demands. I think that the examples of these workers using Privacy Act laws to try and get at the information, it's really interesting, and it certainly draws attention to the information asymmetry issue, but it's not solving the problem. I feel the same way about these data cooperatives that are counter-collecting the data. Because they don't have control over the systems themselves, counter-collecting the data isn't really useful because they don't know what the system is actually determining. The one example that we have in the US is a law that passed in California in 2021, and it was directed specifically at Amazon. And basically, the California legislature said, because Amazon's work quotas, which are determined algorithmically and personalized to workers, were causing such horrible health and safety problems in warehouses. So injuries in Amazon warehouses are 3 times higher than in other warehouses. Workers, I'm sure you've read the stories, people peeing in bottles to meet their quota, just like very, very bad work circumstances. So the legislature passed a law that says, 1, you can't create quotas that interfere with worker health and safety issues, including bathroom breaks. And 2, you have to let workers know what the quota is. So again, this isn't like, it's not like a socialist revolution of the warehouse, right? You're just like, management, right? He would go into workplaces and figure out how to make them more efficient by breaking down tasks. And labor historians and sociologists have largely said that this led to the de-skilling of workforces. It made workers more fungible. It lowered their power in the workforce. So scientific management was not like a good thing for labor power. But if you go back to his early work, part of the way that he justifies the creation of these like little tiny rules that, that workers have to follow is that it creates workplace democracy. That workers can know what the rules are and that they could, in theory, debate the rules with their bosses. And if the bosses said they didn't know, they didn't do the job right, they could say, but look, this is my job, I did it, and like I did it right. There could be some base, and of course like that doesn't bear out, but if you think about that sort of theoretically, that the original form of scientific management, that the founder of scientific management theory thought that this would empower workers by giving them knowledge over the rules. And then you look at digitalized scientific management, which is what algorithmic wage discrimination is, we're in a very different world, because now the rules themselves are completely obscured. Something that arguably on his own terms, even Frederick Taylor would disagree with. Do you have a question, Reza?
Thank you so much for an excellent talk, and it always makes me want to take my phone and check it in a river in a good way. So one of the things that was disappointing to me over the past couple of years is that a lot of the gig economy tech companies seem to avoid the sort of techlash and public accountability that seems to now have sort of come due for companies like Meta and Instagram and a lot of those other companies. And now we're seeing, as Washington sort of convenes on AI, a weird sort of bipartisan consensus about accountability that I haven't seen in a while, but I haven't seen it yet on this issue. And so I wonder if A, you have any thoughts on why that might be the case, and B, if there are any narratives that might help bring about that sort of bipartisan consensus, and frankly, I think anger maybe about it that we haven't seen so far.
So a couple of things. One, there's a really good book called Blood in the Machine about Luddism and about Luddites, and who you might think of as being people who hate technology, but actually are workers during the early industrial revolution who were protesting the fact that they had no role in deciding how technology was used in their own workplaces as it transformed their own lives. And we did these Luddite tribunals as a way to popularize the book, and people actually brought their phones and smashed them. So if you'd like a Boston Luddite tribunal, you could actually chuck your phone into the Charles if that's what you want to do. But in terms of public accountability, you'll see my thoughts on today's Law and Political Economy blog, where I have really just like expressed my extreme disappointment in the Biden executive order with regard to algorithmic with regard to AI. So the order was very good in many ways, set forth a path towards regulatory intervention, as you know, for any number of issues, including national security and public health. Despite Biden claiming and campaigning on being the most worker-friendly president in US history, the AI and work section of the executive order was nothing short of underwhelming. It was a lot of platitudes around how we want to ensure that there's fairness, but there's no language about specific regulations. Literally, he's like, let's make a report. And I just like, this far in to the study in AI and work, you're in an AI order where other administrative bodies are being asked to make regulatory interventions. You're asking the Department of Labor to make a report. It looks very disappointing, and so I thought a lot about like why this is. I mean, part of it is, I think, the myths generated by the kinds of papers that I talked about today. And then the other is just a real commitment to a particular macroeconomic theory of what makes for a robust economy. So, you know, these are not good jobs, but they're jobs. And I think that there are two things going on. One, there's this underlying employer prerogative, the business prerogative, which you see throughout US court decisions from the 18th century onwards. It doesn't even necessarily come from somewhere. There's like no doctrine of the employer prerogative, but you see it referenced in all of these court decisions where you just like give away the ability of workers to have any say in the workplace or to have any rights because of the employer prerogative. The employer has a prerogative over their business model. So this like deeply seated, very American idea of the role of property interests in the corporate context. And then on the other hand, we're in a particular sort of macroeconomic moment of thinking with regard to, well, how do we make a strong economy? What makes the numbers look good? And all of that is deeply tied to, I think, in a certain sort of neoliberal framework, to ensuring that workers have unbridled power in the workplace. I think that Elizabeth Anderson, who's this philosopher at Stanford, she has this really powerful book called Private Governance. And I'm extending her argument to make it my own here, but part of what she argues is that we spend all of our time at work, that you know, a good 50% of our adult lives are spent at work, at least for many of us, sometimes more. And although we pride ourselves in being like to the ideal of democracy, our work is kind of an authoritarian space. So 50% of our time, we're in a space where we have very little to no rights, where we have to obey our employer or we are terminated. And that this is a kind of dystopian thing that we've submitted ourselves to. And then the question becomes why? Why have we submitted ourselves? And you can think about manufacturing consent and hegemony and all, we get into that interesting conversation. But I really think that there's this both a cultural and legal sense that there's very little we can do about what happens in the workplace. And that's just not true.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful,
Oh,
really.
thanks.
I have a really mundane question and then a more general one. So the mundane one is, how does a wage floor work in this context, and what's the relationship to worker supply? Because, tied to this idea of work when you want to is the notion that you get to decide whether you want in or not. And I assume you want the time to start ticking as soon as the person signs into the network. Do you think the systems will sort of have a maximum number of people who can be working at any particular time, and that kind of interferes with the flexibility? And maybe that's just what happens, right? The business model shifts, but so that's my mundane question. I'll ask you the other question afterward. But
yeah, it's an empirical question that I don't know the answer to. In this, I just reviewed a paper, so I know that in the Spanish context, people have not been terminated, largely because there are huge numbers of people who do this casually, but most of the work is done by full-time workers. And so it might be that some of the casual, the companies, when they are in these legislative debates, they give you these numbers that are just dramatic, like, oh, we have 500,000 workers working in California, but many of those workers have maybe worked for 30 minutes for the company. So it doesn't represent the full range of how many people are working. And the little data that we have been able to extract from the companies suggests that 80% of the work is done by people who work more than 37 hours a week. And those people have not been disemployed in the in the Spanish context. But it's an empirical question that probably varies from market to market. But I think that what would change is that it wouldn't be possible for people to use this as unemployment insurance, as many people have been doing. So particularly during the Great Recession, when it was hard to get work, as people were sort of finding a new job, because they didn't have to report this as employment income, they were both applying for unemployment insurance if they were eligible, and doing this work to supplement the very low UI earnings. But the policy fix there is to make UI available to everyone, as we did during the pandemic, and to increase the amount that people are able to earn during that time, not to force them to look for work and work for Uber and displace full-time workers. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question. I'll say thank you first. I have a question about certain data and uncertainty. But first, just to say thank you. The uncertainty in a society where, with credit scores and things like housing requirements, loan requirements, certainty is highly valued. And things like healthcare, we have quality-adjusted life years, life insurance. We have data on what certainty is valued at. So, are those kind of counter certainty value data sets being used at all in these conversations? And how is it so acceptable to promote such deep instability in a society where we need stability, and it's just driving people into horrible states of ill health and homelessness and horrible economic situations, like lowering your credit score just by doing this type of work.
Absolutely.
By de facto.
Thank you so much for saying all of that. It's like, as you're speaking, I feel flushed with emotion again, because I really share your outrage, and I've seen it so many times. So many of my friends who I have made through this research are unhoused, are living in tents, where I've written about some of the situations that they've been put in, not because they're not working really, really, really hard, but because the system was designed to, in all the ways that you're saying, affect not just their ability to make money, but their ability to get housing. Based on their credit score, their ability to do so many, many things. One of the things that troubles me most about these practices is that, so there's, and I've written about this a bit in the, and just to baseline answer your question, no, those conversations are not being had. I don't know why it is so acceptable. I continue to be sort of infuriated, and I've spent literally 10 years of my life trying to get people to see how incredibly unacceptable these practices are, and how awful and exploitative and miserable this work really is. And I think that part of what I wanted to do with this paper is to really shame those of us in the academy who have done really bad science, misused the power that we have to buttress the kinds of narratives that the companies so powerfully push, and that make it so that too many people don't care. But to speak to what you were saying, so one of the things that I have that I'm noticing is that. So it takes, and this will be particularly interesting to those of you in the data science world. So when workers are counter-collecting their data, they're doing it because it's so complicated through another company. And those other companies are data brokers. And those other companies that are data brokers then partner with third-party companies to do things like provide predatory loans, which end up putting people in horrible life situations, influencing their credit over time, to provide really scary products, or the products themselves aren't scary, but the terms of the products are quite scary, including hybrid insurance that ends up being on on just squeezing the worker for every profit that they're able to make off of their wages, because the third-party data brokers end up knowing so much about how much the workers make that they can really manipulate these other systems to mess up their lives. And it's so insidious. And then, but then when you read the data, some of the data, like the management science literature about this, it's like there's no, the way that the management scientists talk about it is solely through the lens of profit and not through the lens of like, well, what kind of impact will this have on these like individuals and communities? And I don't know what that says about the academy, but I share your like deep frustration, anger, and devastation over what's being done.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone is brave enough to do the final question.
I think that was a good end.
Yeah, I agree. So thank you so much for coming. And
thank you guys so much. Everyone's not thoroughly depressed now. I didn't do my job.